Welcome to this week's podcast. We have an interesting introduction. We have a new author and a new book all at the same time. So we have Jason Miller with us from Oklahoma City College. Thanks for joining us, Jason. And Jeff, obviously, from DC Sports Training, helping out as well. And we got to send this shout out this week, obviously, is going to be to Oklahoma City University. We got to represent, obviously, with Jason representing the school there. Jason, this is kind of an interesting thing. We met, quite a few years ago when you were at a different institution, and then we picked up again once you got to Oklahoma City, talking about some of the stuff that we do, and then more recently about this book. You had already written it, and kind of wanted to see how well it might be received on a different platform. And I got to say, honestly, at first I didn't know. I was kind of like a little bit tepid because, we've kind of gone after one particular market up till now, and it was I didn't want to veer way too off of that. But I've always had this idea of reaching a different market with materials that weren't overly, esoteric, complex science stuff. Some stuff that people could use in plain English. Here's some good instructions for how you train. And then when I got the book, and by the way, here we go. We printed it. I really like it a lot. I'm really kind of intrigued now at this point as to how it might do, but I really liked it because it had good practical information. So if you would, just give me a quick idea on your background, academically, and then how you got where you're at with the book.
Okay. Yeah, I wrote the book basically from my own experiences teaching classes, but also being a coach. When I first started in strength conditioning back in the late 90s as a student athlete, and then eventually transitioning into actual coaching at the collegiate level, and then more in the private setting, and then coaching high level athletes. I always was looking for a text that I felt like captured not only some of the theory, but also had real practical examples. I think there's a fair amount of books that have a lot of theory, but even students that I work with before I wrote the book, the complaint was, where are the examples, that I can write a program with? And so that's kind of where the book first started. It was way back like I said, in the late 90s when I was actually spending most of my time coaching and pursuing a career in strength conditioning. That's where I started my academic career, of course, as well. Went on to Utah State University, where I was a GA for a time there in strength conditioning, and then transitioned over into just being a student and doing some training of athletes on the side, and finished my master's degrees there. And then went on to the University of Utah, where I got my degree in exercise physiology in 2010, PhD in exercise physiology. Again, the focus there was more on strength conditioning, though, even though it was an exercise physiology degree. My focus has always been on athletics and developing athletes, trained athletes while I was there. And again, it was that same kind of thing as, as I read all these books and all these texts and research and everything else, I just feel like I couldn't find one source where I could just grab one book and, just kind of get this basic information and this foundational information that was theory, but again, a book that actually applied it right away. There was a few other books that I looked at from, Coach Ken and Paula Quinn, that had some pretty good books. And this was kind of my, combination of their books with, some of the heavy theory books, even like Super Training, where, it'll take a year to read that book and read it well. It says great information, but, it's a heavy book. And so, I always tell students the hardest book you ever read. It's one of the most important, but it's a hard book to read. And so, this book was kind of a bridge, I felt like, to some of that really good information like you'd find from Rick Oshansky, and then, more of the applied stuff that a high school coach could pick up and just start reading and say, hey, I can apply this today.
Yeah, I think that's a big missing piece. And I do some work with high schools, and sometimes I presume that they may know more than they know, and a book can kind of fill that gap, I think.
Okay.
So yeah, the high school coach, I think that sometimes guys that are further up on the academic chain, we forget sometimes things that you take for granted that aren't known
right.
by the high school coach.
Right.
Or the college coach even.
I was say even some of the beginning college coaches.
College coaches. Yeah, there's a lot of things that aren't known. And so that's kind of what piqued my interest in doing this, because you start forgetting a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, because what happens is it's kind of like with the guys who write high level books. They think you know what they mean by
Right.
everything, and they forget that you don't. And so now we're maybe I'm a step down the food chain, but I'll assume they know, high school coach will know something that he doesn't know.
Right.
You know what I mean? Make assumptions. So what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, and this is kind of different, but I think will be fun, is let's go through the book just a little bit and just kind of talk about it, because I want people to know, not vaguely what the book's about, but kind of dig into the specifics. So if you wouldn't mind, take me through the book a little bit, in a sequential order, to kind of give the reader an idea of what they're going to get out of this book.
Absolutely. Well, the first chapter of the book is some of the theory. So, I even told the reader in the book, I mean, it could be skipped. It's not essential to understand the rest of the book, but if you understand, why you set up a certain set and rep scheme, that chapter will answer those questions on like the size principle and the 3 different types of resistance training, dynamic, maximal, repetition training, the fitness fatigue model. So, why do you set up a workout daily in such an order that maybe you do the sprint training first and you do the high volume stuff last? I mean, those are questions a lot of times in coaching that are simple questions, but sometimes the coach doesn't know. I think a lot of times when we first start on coaching, especially, we take a program that already exists, which is not a bad thing, and then we just kind of run with that program, but we get to the point where we get stuck. I've been doing this program for X amount of years. It seems like it's working in some ways, but not in others. How do I transition to something else? What do I do? And I think understanding some of this basic theory will help guide, expanding an additional program that's already established, or maybe transitioning to another program or writing their own program for the first time. So those are the big, the big concepts in that first chapter is, that background theory, and that again that guides everything in terms of picking the right, sets and rep scheme, like I mentioned before, or again ordering exercise weekly or daily or whatever it might be. And so I've tried not to inundate the book with a lot of citations. Certainly I cite when necessary, but the book wasn't intended as a text. It's intended to be an easy reader for any coach at any level to pick up, or anybody that just loves to train to pick up. It's not just a coach, a trainer, anybody could pick this book up and, have that capsule of information. So that's the first chapter, though, is a lot of that theory, things that you probably find in more of a textbook, but I like to think I've written it so it's a little bit easier to maybe understand and, less technical, but that will give the reader a basis to move on to write a program. And so let me back up for a second. Obviously, the book is about weight training. I didn't write it for, sprint training or plyometric jump training or any of that type of activity. It's written specifically for resistance training. So that's the foundation of that first chapter as well, as it's driven towards resistance training programming. The second chapter is, looking more at just developing the basic variables that we're going to manipulate in a training program. So intensity and volume. And I think a lot of times understanding what the best intensity variable is a challenge. So, I've worked with junior high athletes all the way up to, athletes that are competing in the Olympic Games. The way I define intensity might be different between all those athletes. And so, it could be just a rep driven intensity. It could be, of course, percent of 1RM is the classic way to do it. It could be RPE. There's a variety of ways that might be appropriate at different times of the year, or with, athletes go out of town. It's hard to prescribe percent 1RM when they didn't sleep all night because they're on vacation. It's hard to use a percent 1RM then. So in that chapter, just provided some definitions of intensity, volume as well, how to calculate that, and probably one of the most important variables I feel like in weight training, which is volume load, or load volume, some people call it, which is the combination of the two. And that's the best way to track the amount of stimulus you're putting on an athlete. Some coaches call it tonnage, right? It's the same idea.
Yeah.
We have a way to quantify the stimulus, over time, to make sure that we're providing enough stimulus for change and recovery.
Okay, if you don't mind, I'd like to, on both of those two, just kind of ask a couple questions just to kind of fill in the blanks there. Because you made that point that this is about weight training. It's not necessarily about the other. But I think that the weight training, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is in the context of developing an athlete, though, not
Absolutely.
necessarily just to be a power lifter or a weightlifter.
No, it's for the athlete.
So we're talking context here. Yeah, right. So we're talking about the resistance training aspect of developing an athlete,
right,
on a practical level, for the most part. And the I think you tell me if I'm correct here. The chapter one is kind of geared so that because one of the things that I see with high school guys is they tear off a program and they just follow it.
Right.
And basically, the chapter one's going to give them an idea of the variables so that they can start being able to develop their own,
right,
and being fluid with it, too, because as we both know, a program, quote unquote, it's got lots of limitations, and so understanding the principles behind a program will allow you to kind of detail something and know how to make changes.
Exactly, and that's probably one of the biggest things. I mean, I remember being a young coach and trying to write my programs from scratch, and that's a challenge when you don't have as much experience yet. And so a lot of times it's not a bad idea to grab a program that's to the correct level. I mean, I wouldn't grab Penn State's strength program for my junior high athletes. That's that's not a bet. But if I had another junior high program level, or junior high level program, that's okay to start with. But you're right. I mean, in order to tweak that and to fit it to my guys or my gals that I'm training or whatever it might be, I need to make sure that I understand the variables that need to be manipulated. And the effects of doing that, that's where, like I said, like fitness fatigue model understanding can help with something like that. Why don't you do the high volume training on Monday? Well, this is why, because you carry that as a high fatigue cost the rest of the week. And so now all your dynamic and maximal training the rest of the week is going to be subpar.
Yeah.
So that should give the coach at least some information to start making good decisions about how to adjust a program.
And one other point I think that needs to be made, because you just touched upon it a little bit there, is that what I see from my vantage point is that a lot of times the high school level and lower, the workloads are too high for the athlete. And would you agree? And kind of,
I would. And all that technique that's associated with that volume is poor. So, doing 8 sets of 8 back squats incorrectly. I mean, basically it's just a lower back exercise at that point. And so it's no surprise in that we have lots of injuries. So maybe taking a step back and looking at what might be appropriate for that athlete.
Yeah, no, and that's a wonderful point, because that's one of the things that anytime I've had been called upon by high schools, is the workload is so high. I'm like, guys, you can't get anything done here. Plus, and the problem is with the high school coach is he doesn't understand technique. Like, for example, he's talking about squats. The risk of back problems, I think, is astronomical at the high school level, because when you go in and watch how they train, it's terrible technique.
Yeah, and there's too many kids to coach ratio. I mean, you got high school. I remember working with a high school coach, and he had 80-to-1 ratio.
Oh, it's terrible.
What are you going to do with that? I mean,
you can get nothing done.
It's pretty tough.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. Now that leads into a little bit on chapter 2 there. When you're like in here, you're talking about prescribing intensities and things like this, and whatnot, and repetition ranges. I think that's the other idea there is look what how these affect you, and then at the age level, and certain intensity levels don't make sense at certain age levels at all ever. I'm assuming,
I mean, the kids can lift really heavy, but the problem is technical, right? Again, it goes back to, an 8-year-old kid could do 1RM back squats, but how many 8-year-old kids can execute a 1RM back squat correctly? Not many. So what's the point of doing it then if, these kids are just going to get hurt?
Yeah.
So, right. I mean, at that point, then they're training, obviously in their training life anyway, that's not the prime variable to be working on anyway. But I'm just saying anybody can train heavy. It's just like we talked about just a second ago.
Good technique.
Piece is the problem.
Good technique. Okay, well, take us through chapter 3 then, and kind of give us the ideas that are presented in there.
This is where when I first started the book or started thinking about the book, this is what I was thinking about, was set and repetition structure. Because I remember looking when I was a young coach, and then even when I started in academia a little bit more, wanted to see where do we get all this data from that has driven set and repetition structure. And surprisingly, there's not a lot of research on something that you would think would be so simple and heavily researched. You would think set and repetition structures have been researched into the ground. Some of the best research we have was back in the 60s. And so that's where a lot of this, our set and repetition structures come from, at least in the research side. Now, of course, bodybuilders over the years and people that are involved at the barbell, any sort of capacity, and have an appreciation for like the size principle, motor and recruitment, things like that are explained in chapter 1, have developed these, schemes of organizing training day that make the most sense for developing certain qualities like muscle strength or muscle power or hypertrophy muscle size. And so this chapter is all about the different ideas and the different ways you can structure a resistance training program within a day. So ascending pyramids, descending pyramids, skewed pyramids, auto-regulation, so it runs the gamut from more of the idea of like, this would be for a simpler athlete. I try to put in there, okay, if you have a simple athlete, maybe sets across is the most appropriate way to set up a scheme. If you have a more trained athlete, maybe these are some structures that make more sense for them. If you don't have a trained athlete, maybe don't bother with some of these. Because we talk about high school, a lot of high school coaches think over-program. They over-volume and they over-program, where the kids really just need good technical movement, get in and out of the weight room, learn how to move properly with a simple exercise routine. The simpler the athlete, the simpler the program, I always say. And so that's what I try to tackle here as well, is give the coach a variety of different strategies, and then try to provide them with an idea of what strategy makes the most sense for what athlete.
So this, it's interesting to me that you touched upon on this, because it's something that I just not long ago had a conversation. I was being asked by people at the high school level, because like the different coaches at the high school level would say, well, and I've had and Jeff's had this experience too. People say, oh, that can't be enough volume. You got to do more sets. I just can't believe that you can go with these minimal doses. And instead of arguing the minimal dose perspective, which is validated, but what I do is say, well, show me where the research is on where you came up with how many ever sets. Where's it at? Where did 3 sets of 10 come from? Where did 5 sets of 5 come from? Where did whatever it is that they're doing? I said, show me where the evidence is, and there isn't any. Like you just said, it's thin.
Yeah. I mean, we know the sources of those things, but you're right. Like the actual research, 3 sets of 10 came out of rehabilitation of World War II soldiers, with Dr. DeLorme and then Watkins.
Yeah. You'd like to think we're a little further ahead than that.
Yeah, but we're not. It's
70 years later, right?
Yeah, it's even like the ice controversy right now. I mean, we think something that's been working for so long, actually, it doesn't work. So
it's been a crock the whole time.
It's been a crock the whole time. So I mean, there's no research really. I mean, there's a spattering of sets and repetition research that was used for another. The idea of the study was for something else.
Yeah.
Not which one of these is best.
Yeah.
But there, again, you would think there'd be 50 studies on, set and repetition schemes, and ordering of. But there's not. There's hardly any in academia.
There's
There's very little, and I even covered that in the very first part of the book. And the preface is, I love research. Obviously, this is what I do for a living as a professor too. But the research doesn't hold all the answers for strength conditioning. I think a good coach is a evidence-based practitioner, but you're not going to find a research study that says use this particular method for this athlete, because it's just the research doesn't exist. So. That's why I think this book could be helpful to the coach as well. Is I'm trying to pull on the research we do have, but also my own experience coaching athletes at different levels, and hopefully it's a nice combination for the coach to make good decisions in their programming.
Absolutely, I think that calling into question what has been assumed as convention, my opinion, is huge. Yeah. I think that's really important what you're doing there, because there's this presumption out there that a bodybuilding's really affected athlete development probably more than anything.
Yeah.
That high volume, some higher intensity, and trying to apply it to the wrong person in the wrong way, it has been pervasive, and it hasn't been questioned. So the set and rep schemes, like you said, it's been pervasive, but it's really kind of ironic. It's a mirage. It's kind of like the ice thing. It's nobody ever questioned whether or not it actually worked.
Yeah,
because it doesn't.
And, I think we all knew it didn't, but we just didn't say anything almost.
And they're still not doing. I know people who work in sports, and they said try not bringing ice when somebody gets injured and see what.
Oh yeah, it's hard.
You're gonna get fired.
Tell athletes not to use it; they're addicted to it, basically.
Yeah, and even the institution will say you're being negligent if you don't bring it out. You could get in trouble. and not only is it not beneficial for the athlete, it's actually harmful in the sense that it holds up the healing process. Yeah. And the same thing with stretching. There's all you got to stretch prevents injuries. Yeah. No, it doesn't.
No.
There's very little research that shows it prevents injuries.
Well, and it's funny, the studies on that is where research really struggles. You read a study, some of these old studies that say static stretching promotes healing. But then you read another one that says it doesn't. And the problem is understanding who the athletes were or the individuals were. So if you have somebody who's like a basketball player who's clinically stiff, could be defined as clinically stiff. And I'm not a static stretching fan at all. But if you were going to do any PNF or static stretching, that'd be the athlete do it. But if you do it with anybody else, you're going to promote hypermobility, which is why we saw research where static stretching hurts people. So
it actually creates the injury.
We struggle with like, well, I don't understand why this is different. Well, it's because if you don't have any practical experience sometimes in the field, you don't understand the difference between a basketball player and a soccer player.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think that's, I love academia. It's great. But a lot of times I think sometimes we struggle with in academia is but coaches tell me this and they don't know my background, but say, get out of the laboratory, actually get in the weight room. It's like, well, I am, but I understand that feeling from the coaching side is like, well, you guys you're researching things that don't really happen in practice.
No, you're exactly right. And the other misnomer that's out there is people think that we study athletes in the United States, and we don't.
We don't, not anymore. There's no money in it. We study disease populations. So
yeah, we don't study athletes. So there's no such thing in this country. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of ways, the strength and conditioning field is built on real shifty ground.
It is,
in the sense that you might have went to school and got a PhD in exercise science, biomechanics, physiology. That doesn't mean you know how to train athletes.
No, it doesn't.
Even the master's degree and getting the certification on some of them, it's weak. The education part of it is weak. We don't teach how to coach.
No.
An athlete. So I think that this is kind of a neat little tool that comes in there and says, look, let's at least dispel the myths,
right?
One, and then let's get some ideas on some things that actually have a rational basis based upon research. And then I can also say, based on what the Russians did, because the Russians did research this stuff, and the plans they came up with seemed to work pretty good. And
they won a lot.
Yeah, they won a lot.
They were doing something right.
That was kind of the idea. They were doing something right because a lot of gold medals they took home. So, so I love that you're bringing that out, because I think this hits the nail on the head of different areas where there's this big vacuum or gap. A lot of assumptions being made that are not true, and people basing whole, if you want to call it a philosophy, for a whole situation based upon information that's not really valid.
Or at least it's not solid. Instead, to recognize it and say, look, this, and that's the whole thing with strength conditioning. The first thing I always tell my students is the two words you need to learn first is it depends. Because people always ask you, what should I do with this, that? It depends. I mean, it depends on how old they are. It depends on their mobility. I mean, they're hypermobile in their, the lumbar spine, and then they're stiff in their hip. I mean, there's so many factors that, what kind of athlete are they? What kind of equipment do you have? And so this book, at least will provide some foundation for, I hope, for every coach, whether they have a 40,000 square foot training facility or they have.
So going into chapter 4, give me the ideas there about the different training complexes that are used.
Yeah. And so, chapter 3 was kind of in the hope that the coach finds this useful, and that chapter 3 could be a basic programming, like this is just basic strength programming. Well, chapter 4, and then moving into chapter 5 is more like, okay, if I have athletes maybe more intermediate to advanced, maybe not elite, but intermediate to advanced athletes, what are some of the things I could start to implement? So, high school, high level high school athletes, and maybe even now getting into college athletes. I think some of these concepts that have been around for a while, I try to define them a little bit more, like complexes. What is a training complex? Verkhoshansky obviously did a lot of research on training complexes, and how to set up that complex. And, what are some different ideas and rules that give the rules of complexes, that need to be followed in order to get the most out of them. So the training complex, right? I'm thinking more in this particular book about a heavy light type of combination, or even like a French contrast method. We're trying to maximize power output. So again, the hope is, as I went through the book, as a coach could say, okay, what do I do next? I've got the basics. I got a more advanced athlete. What do I do with them? So that's the idea with chapter 3 is just trying to outline, here's an advanced technique. And maybe some of the other things that are considered complex as well, like, antagonist, agonist, pairings and supersetting, obviously, all these different other concepts that are complexes, what would they be used for? Yeah. So that's the point of chapter 3, is just to give the coach, here's a little bit more how to set up a, optimal flow, if you will, in the program. So the chapter 4, you're kind of getting into there with like how to use these techniques and where to use them at. Yeah. Like, how do you set up, just some definitions initially, but, what do they look like? I think most coaches probably have an appreciation what a superset looks like, but just to remind them, here's some good pairings and here's some things to think about. And then if we think about a complex as, trying to optimize power, that's a little different than obviously an antagonist superset. So this is maybe what a complex would look like in order to optimize a vertical jump or something like that. So it's just a lot of these different combinations of exercises basically, and how those work together.
I like that. I think that's a great idea. And so you kind of, I think the key being, what is the tool? What's the aim of the tool? And where do I place it at?
Exactly.
Because I think one of the things that I see, you correct me if I'm wrong, is I see a lot of things misplaced.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like people will ask me about, let's say, for example, plyometrics or some of these other things, and they have them placed wrong.
Right.
Like even like in just within the workout, they're wrong.
Right.
They don't realize, like a depth jump, that needs to be the very first thing you do that workout.
Exactly.
And a lot of people don't.
Chapter 1 will help with that stuff, hopefully.
Yeah, and that so
exactly.
That's a key.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's huge. And like I said, here goes back to something you assume they knew and they don't.
Right.
So I think that the placement, where it fits and who it, what kind of a workout does it fit in, and then what time of year does it fit relative to the competitive season or whatever the case may be. It's critical, especially at the high school level. And at the college level, I would say those issues are actually relevant at the college level too.
Mm-hmm.
And I see a lot of misplacement of things in the wrong time of year, or this is maybe not relevant to the book so much, but they don't even know what plyometrics are technically.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? They don't even know what
training.
it is.
It's not just jump training.
Exactly. There's a big distinction between jump training and plyometric training. So I like that idea, and I think that's going to be a vital importance to college and high school level, across the board, really, because I think there's a lot of misinformation about that. Take me into chapter 5. Now, you got some strategies that are more advanced, and I see here that you got talking about velocity training. It's kind of Brian Mann's been his thing as of late, and we podcasted with him a little bit, and then. Some of the stuff that some people might see with Westside, the chains and bands. I think Louis probably popularized those the most of anybody that I know of.
Exactly.
And
that's exactly what it is.
And the weight releasers, I think that was kind of an idea that one of the things that he popularized as well. And then the triphasic stuff with our good friend Cal, his idea. And I'm interested to see these topics being covered in your book and how you explain them. Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, a lot of them are obviously UAC related authors like Cal. His book, and it was interesting. I read Cal's book. I've been thinking about those things for a while. I think a lot of coaches probably have, but to see somebody actually that did a nice job of implementing all those things with his athletes, I mean, it was like, well, yeah, this is good stuff. And so, I include these more advanced type of training methods in this section and try to, like you said, explain them maybe a little bit. So a high school or college coach could easily pick it up. Not like Cal's book's not easy to pick up, but this is just a summation here. This is the information. I mean, his programs are pretty complex compared to maybe a high school program, and rightly so. He's at a Division I school. So, the other topics in there, like you mentioned, I plucked from, and what I use as a coach as well. I use these with my athletes that I train. I have 2 barbell clubs, weightlifting clubs I train. I use all these methods with them. The high level rowers I work with, we've used velocity training with. So these are some of the newest things out there, I guess. Some of them are older than others, like combinating resistance has been around a while, but I try to explain to the coach, what are they? And if you have the equipment, like with velocity training, you have to have some sort of unit. I'm not saying I support the Tendo unit, but it's usually the easiest one. You have to have this equipment in order to execute these strategies. And so, what do you need to do it? What's the best way to get that equipment? Can you get it? And if you can, if you have an athlete that is advanced enough to use it, this is how, at least the basic way how to use it. And so, again, trying to extend upon the knowledge from chapter 3, which here's the basics. Chapter 4, here's how to organize a little more, pair up things. Then chapter 5, here's some things maybe you could, if you have the equipment and the budget to do, add these things in. And for those, again, intermittent to advanced athletes, help them keep pushing beyond, just doing the basic stuff over and over again. I'm a huge fan of combinating resistance. You mentioned Louis, obviously well read in the Russian authors. In his combinating resistance, though, is I use that even a lot with my own with my weightlifters, which is maybe more of a, people most think of that with powerlifting, but I use it with high velocity sports, weightlifting, and any field and court sport athletes as well that I train. I mean, I think it's a fantastic way to develop power. But I try to cover in the book even something like that. We don't really have a lot of data from the research. There's a few studies starting to come out, but a lot of it's based on some of what Louis have done over the years And some of my own experiences, like how much load do you put on the bar? Like how much real weight do you put on the bar versus how much chain weight? I mean, those are questions that a coach probably want to ask is, does it matter? Well, yeah, it matters, on that scale of if you put more load on the bar and less chain, what does that mean? What if you put more chain on? So those are things I try to address in a simple manner. Try to be honest that we don't have all the answers, but what we do know from basic biomechanics and the research we do have, this probably be the best way to implement these practices.
It's funny that you say that, because I remember reading some of Louis' stuff, and then just kind of I was interested in the use of the chains and the bands, and that was I'm no genius, so I'm like, okay, now how do you figure out which band with how much weight on which lift with what percentage you're trying to get done that day? Let's say it's a dynamic every day, and I'm like, man, this seems real complicated, the equation, if you will, right? But you go into this.
At least a little bit, touch on enough that I think somebody gets started. And again, it goes back to it depends though too. I mean,
yeah, sure.
If somebody's not very strong, I mean, they probably don't need to be using accommodating resistance anyway. But right. What scale or what range would be appropriate for somebody, and same with the velocity training stuff. I mean, that's not going to be for everybody. That's usually for higher level athletes, or like a lot of Division I universities are using that now as part of their training. It's a fantastic way to train. But I mean, it may not be accessible to people. And we have the same questions there as well, though, is how fast should you move the bar? I mean, what are the velocity, ranges that are appropriate?
Right.
So, I try to cover that as much as I can. And the ideas that, I've had over the years as well. And there's a few research studies that are finally starting to come out, but I think it's going to be a while before we have some definitive answers.
Yeah. I think that the Russians had done the research on it, but like you said, I don't think anything had been done here.
No.
So this is kind of like this new concept to us.
It is.
When they were doing it, however long ago, it's still new here. And so it's still relevant here, right?
Yeah.
And so two things that I think are interesting there is that with the velocity stuff, I'm assuming that you make, notes and explanation of the percentage-based stuff, kind of, if you don't have a Tendo, you don't have a gym aware, you can use percentages as a mechanism to kind of figure out where you need to be at on that.
On the velocity training?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and just the speed of the bar too. But it's more about feel. I mean, there's a couple ways you can do it. I mean, you can put, you could say I'm going to use X amount of weight, right, and then move it so fast.
Yeah.
And then if I move it faster than I should, then I'll add more weight.
Yeah.
Or you can subscribe the other way. So I mean, there's different ways you can do it, and that's the beauty of velocity training is, you get away from the strict percentage training. Let's just put X amount on the bar. It doesn't matter if you feel good or not. Do it.
Yeah.
I failed. Well, okay. Well, you didn't feel good today, or I'm on today.
Yeah.
Let's put a little more weight on the bar. You're moving the bar really quickly with this low. That's the beauty of velocity training. It goes back to auto regulation stuff. That like you mentioned, Brian Mann. He's one of the few that's done some research in the research with it.
Yeah.
Trying to fit the day to the athlete, not trying to just shove the athlete in a day.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think that and what you touched upon with the like accommodating resistance, the weight releasers and things like this, contrast training, like you said, for somebody who's a little more advanced. And I think one of the things that, is important for people to take away is that those methods, you use them when you need them, just because they're cool and they seem like the latest, greatest. If you're not at a place where they're,
don't bother.
You know what I mean? So this is one of the things I try to explain to a lot of different people who might call and ask questions and stuff is that, like with block periodization, for example, people say, well, I'm going to start using the block periodization with my athletes at the high school, college level. I'm like, why? Yeah. They developed it because they ran out. The classical model started to fail at the high level,
right?
But at the low and the intermediate level, it was working just fine.
Yep.
And it's overkill.
Right? Yeah.
And it would be overkill for an athlete at the low level. He couldn't handle it.
Well, when I explained it, you hit it right on the head. It's, block training, you only have so many energy tokens per week, right? So if you're an elite athlete, you're trying to squeeze out 0.5% of some variable, then you're going to have to provide a lot of stimulus to do that. But if you're a high school kid that is just starting out, I mean, you can train everything at once in the correct order.
Right.
You're going to see amazing results. I mean, it's more about, like you said, with the complex training. If you're a high school coach and you have 25 athletes in your weight room, you don't need chains. Just teach them how to squat, teach them how to deadlift, teach them how to, if you feel like the bench is important, teach them how to overhead press, spend your time on that. And then use some of the basic schemes that are in this book. They'll get stronger. if you have an athlete, you're working, 2-on-1 or 3-on-1, or like my weightlifters, I have 15 weightlifters that are more advanced. Okay, then we start to tinker with some of the stuff that they need a little bit extra stimulus. They need a little bit of variety to get them, advancing. Try to squeeze that 1% out of them, in the next couple of weeks. So, again, simpler the athlete, the simpler the program.
Yeah, I like that idea that you're bringing that out, because I think there's this tendency, especially in the United States, to get too fancy.
Yeah, we overprogram.
And the new coolest thing to use, and this is the magic bullet, and there's no such thing. You got to master the fundamentals, and then you go along. You use a tool when you need it, because now what you were doing is not working anymore. So now that's when you bring in the new tool for that reason, to push through a barrier, whatever the case may be. But don't try to use it earlier, because it's not going to have any additional value to you.
Yeah, it's a waste of time.
Yeah, it's a waste of time, and actually could ruin you for the future, because now you've introduced yourself to a stimulus that won't be the same stimulus later.
It won't be novel, that's for sure. Right?
No, it won't be novel.
Chains. Like, I've been using chains. It's not well. A lot of the chain is cool for advanced athletes. Like, what is this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even there's a little bit of placebo effect. Like, this is going to help me. Well, whatever it takes to get
whatever works.
Better.
Right.
If you think it works, then it works. You know what I mean? So you're right. I mean, and again, just the whole idea, if a kid's chain squatting and they can't squat, well, probably just learn how to squat first.
Pointless, right?
Yeah. So let's start with the basics.
Right. So take me into the last chapter, chapter 6, about the organization of training, the variety and tapering ideas. Take us into that.
Yeah, I mean, the crux of the book so far had been more geared towards daily training, but I do want to provide some sort of weekly training guidelines, or at least some ideas. Obviously, you open up a lot of variables then when you start to expand out of a day into a week or a month, or get into mesocycle level. And so I just provide some structure there and some ideas about, how to maybe organize a weekly training sessions, and maybe incorporating some of these other things, like we did some speed training or whatever it might be. What might a typical week look like? Incorporating weight training into that, of course. What are the appropriate days to rest, if assuming everything is an optimal world? I gave some examples as well, some programs that are directly out of programs I've written for either the high-level rowers I worked with, or the weightlifters I've been working with over the last 4 or 5 years. As well. So, try to give, again, a level up from that daily programming, and included some tapering as well, some ideas on how to best get the best out of athletes, going into a competition or whatever it might be, and some of the prevailing research, mostly from Dr. Mujica, about, what's the best way to taper down. Just, again, anything that could help the coach try to develop that basic knowledge when they're writing their program.
So to kind of, I guess, grab the whole book in short, basically the idea is to introduce basic principle and concepts, so that you can start to move from getting pre-made programs to kind of learning the principles, so that you can learn how to create your own, and then also the variables involved, so that that, like, okay, what's the next step and the next step,
yes,
and how to progress, I guess.
Exactly.
That's the thing.
Everything's a progression, and you see athletes that do get stagnant.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a problem as well. I mean, you do the same high school program, and then you do it in college, and you wonder why the gains in strength and speed aren't happening anymore. Well, you keep doing the same thing over and over again. So that's one thing the Russians, I think, did a nice job, and what Louis has promoted as well, is variety, especially in advanced athletes. Variety is a big deal. And monotony is a killer, both mentally and physiologically, though. Both of them are a killer.
Yeah.
It's a killer, both of them. So
absolutely. And so as you go through the rest of the book, you cover the intensity and volume, how they vibe off of each other, and then how to appropriately apply the right amounts to the level of the athlete. That's huge. I think it's a key point, and I don't see that as much in a lot of other writings. So I think that that might actually be new.
Yeah,
I mean, in the literature, even.
I think they'll find it useful, at least.
Yeah, I mean, even new in the literature, amongst what people would find book wise. I don't think there's a lot of that there. You know what I mean? There's general ideas, but not as specific. Like practical as yours are. And so going through those, we're going to go through the sets and reps structures, looking at some of the different ideas on how to get bigger.
Mm-hmm.
You talk a little bit about HIIT training. Mm-hmm. Those ideas, pyramids and such, which I think are interesting. And then you go into the more advanced ideas. Number one, how to put the complexes together, what fits with what, how they vibe off of each other. And then the advanced strategies, obviously the velocity-based and triphasic and chains and bands, and then how to organize. And I think that this is going to be, a wonderful. I don't want to say starter book even, but a fundamental book.
Yeah, foundational. That's what.
It's foundational. I think it's
some foundational
named.
I would never say that, this is the book for everything. I mean, nobody can say that, but I hope it would give any coach or trainer, or it's just somebody who likes to lift, a solid foundation of information to structure good programming.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're right on. I think you hit the nail on the head. And I'm really glad that, we made this connection to do this book. While it's somewhat different from what we normally do, I think it's necessary. I really do, because I think that, we're having conversations about stuff that are way too advanced for the level of athlete that the people have. And
right.
What we should be is they should come back here and read this first. Right.
Yeah, it'll be helpful for
and then move from there. Right. If you don't understand what's in here, you don't have any business reading the other stuff.
Right.
And I think, and more people than you would guess need this.
Mm-hmm.
Way more people than you would guess. I get surprised at what you people don't know. Who hold a job in the field.
Yep.
So anyway, I really appreciate, number one, you bringing the book to me, and secondly for coming on today to answer the questions and fill in the blanks for me. I really appreciate it. And I think maybe we got to get back together again and maybe go into more depth a little bit, maybe on some of the individual concepts, or maybe let you kind of explain them. I think that would be great. So thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll be talking again here soon.
I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to be a part of the USA family, for sure.
Thank you. We're proud to have you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll have him cut the recording there. So, hey, Jeff, we're done. Oh, you're good. We're good. We got it. So you can go ahead and click it. I mean, we just said goodbye just then. So you can click it. You can cut it.